Somewhere out there, an animal you've never met might already know exactly who you are. Not your name, not your job, just your face. And whether you're someone to trust or someone to watch. That's not a horror movie setup. That's just Tuesday if you happen to live near crows. In Seattle, researchers ran an experiment that sounds almost too simple to matter. They put on a single, specific mask, a caveman mask, nothing scary, nothing aggressive looking, and used it while trapping and briefly handling wild crows for study. Then they took the mask off, released the birds, and walked away. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Years later, crows that had never personally been trapped, crows that weren't even born yet during the original experiment, started scolding and diving at anyone wearing that exact mask. The original birds had taught their chicks. The chicks told their flockmates. Within a few years, an entire neighborhood of crows treated a rubber caveman mask like a wanted poster, passed down through actual crow generations. Let that sink in for a second. A bird with a brain the size of a walnut built a multi-generational grudge system, and it's still running in some neighborhoods over a decade later. So today, we're looking at the animals that genuinely never forget, the real science behind why and what it says about memory itself, in any species, including yours. Crows aren't even the most impressive example here. They're just the one with the best documented receipts. Elephants take this to an entirely different level. Researchers studying elephant herds in Africa have tracked individuals recognizing specific humans, specific watering holes, and specific danger zones, sometimes decades after a single encounter. There's a well-known case of elephants that, years after a severe drought, led their herd in a completely different direction the next time conditions started looking similar. Essentially rerouting based on a memory of a disaster that happened before some of the younger elephants were even born. And here's the detail that always gets people. Elephants don't just remember threats, they remember the bones. Researchers have documented elephants returning again and again over years to the remains of herd members who died, gently touching the skulls and tusks with their trunks. Nobody's entirely sure what's going on in their heads when that happens, but it's clearly not nothing. Horses do something similar on a smaller, more personal scale. Multiple studies have shown horses can recognize human faces in photographs months after a single brief interaction, and they respond differently depending on whether that face was associated with kindness or with stress. People who work with rescue horses will tell you the same thing over and over. A horse that was mistreated by someone wearing, say, a specific hat or moving a particular way can carry that association for years, long after the actual danger is gone. Which brings up an obvious, slightly uncomfortable question. If a horse can hold on to a memory like that for years, and a crow can run an inherited grudge campaign for over a decade, why does this exist at all? What's the actual evolutionary point of never letting something go? Turns out forgetting is expensive, and remembering even unpleasant things used to be a survival skill. An animal that quickly forgot which predator almost killed it, which berry made it sick, or which human tried to trap it, didn't usually get a second chance to learn the lesson properly. The ones that held on to that information, even the uncomfortable parts, tended to live longer and pass that same memory-keeping wiring onto their offspring. In other words, a long memory for threats isn't a glitch. It's one of the oldest competitive advantages in nature. Now, here's where scientists start disagreeing a little, which honestly makes the topic more interesting, not less. Some researchers argue that what looks like grudge holding in animals is really just simple associative learning. Stimulus, response, nothing emotional required. A crow doesn't need to feel resentment to avoid a mask. It just needs to link that visual pattern to danger, the same way you might flinch at a specific ringtone after a string of bad phone calls. Other researchers push back on that, pointing out that the sheer complexity of some of this behavior, especially the social teaching part, crows literally informing other crows who've never seen the threat themselves, looks a lot more sophisticated than a basic reflex. Teaching requires some understanding that another individual doesn't already know something. That's not nothing. The honest answer, like most honest answers in animal behavior research, is probably somewhere in the middle. It might not be grudges in the dramatic cinematic sense, but it's also clearly more than a simple mindless reflex. And here's a fun one to sit with. Octopuses Despite having a nervous system that barely resembles ours, despite living solitary lives with basically zero social teaching, have still been observed in labs squirting water specifically at researchers they seem to dislike while leaving other staff members alone entirely. One particular octopus reportedly developed a habit of soaking the exact same lab assistant repeatedly, apparently just for being annoying. Nobody taught that octopus anything about grudges. It just decided on its own terms who deserved the splash. There's an even stranger case in the ocean, and it might be the longest documented memory in the entire animal kingdom. Dolphins in captivity have been shown to recognize the specific calls of other dolphins they were housed with decades earlier, even after 20 years of separation, with zero contact in between. Researchers played back individual contact calls, the dolphin equivalent of a name, recorded from animals some of the test subjects hadn't heard since they were young. The dolphins reacted immediately, approaching the speaker and vocalizing back, the exact same way they would to a friend they'd just seen yesterday. 20 years is roughly a third of a bottlenose dolphin's entire lifespan. Imagine recognizing a single phone call from someone you haven't spoken to since elementary school, instantly, without a single hint beforehand. And it's not just about friendly recognition either. Killer whales, which travel in tight related family pods, have been observed altering their hunting and travel patterns for years after losing a pod member to human activity, sometimes avoiding entire stretches of coastline associated with a traumatic event, long after any actual danger has passed. Marine biologists studying these pods describe behavior that looks less like a fixed instinct and more like an evolving inherited map of places we don't go anymore, updated and passed down the same way human families pass down old warnings about a dangerous road or a bad neighborhood, minus the actual conversation. Now, here's a phrase you've probably heard 100 times, usually as a joke. Goldfish only have a 3-second memory. It's one of those facts that everybody just accepts, the same way everybody accepted that we only use 10% of our brains. Except, like most things everybody just accepts, it's not actually true. Researchers have trained fish, including goldfish, to navigate mazes, recognize specific feeding times, and respond to specific sounds with memories that hold up for months, not seconds. One often cited study even trained fish to escape a net at a particular spot in their tank by sounding a tone beforehand. Months later, with no further training at all, the fish still avoided that spot the instant they heard the same tone. So the 3-second memory thing isn't science. It's just a comforting myth that happened to be repeated enough times to feel true. Which, honestly, says something interesting about human memory too. We're not immune to confidently remembering things incorrectly either. And that brings up something worth sitting with. This isn't really just an animal story. The exact same wiring that makes a crow avoid a mask for over a decade is, structurally, not that different from the part of your own brain responsible for phobias. Most fears that seem completely irrational from the outside, a specific sound, a particular smell, an ordinary object that happens to trigger a flinch, trace back to a single, sharp, emotionally loaded memory, sometimes from decades earlier, sometimes from childhood, often barely remembered consciously at all. Your brain isn't malfunctioning when that happens. It's running the exact same ancient survival software a crow is running. It just doesn't bother asking your permission first. So, what does all of this actually tell us about memory itself? Maybe that the line between useful survival information and holding a grudge is a lot blurrier than we like to think. In animals, and honestly, in us too. The exact same emotional architecture that lets a crow avoid a dangerous mask for a decade is, structurally, not that different from the part of your brain that still tenses up a little around a smell, a song, or a street corner connected to something that happened years ago. We just have better vocabulary for it. The crow doesn't get to write a journal entry about it. It just remembers, teaches its kids, and waits by the tree. So the next time you walk past a crow that seems to be staring at you a little too intently, maybe give it the benefit of the doubt, or maybe don't wear a weird mask around it. Either way, somewhere in that tiny skull, a very old, very stubborn filing system is quietly deciding whether you're a threat worth remembering. For years, possibly for generations, long after you've completely forgotten the moment ever happened at all.